You're listening to, or watching maybe, Private Members Club, and here we are again. Hi, I'm JR.
Hi, I'm Matt.
I'm John.
So, looks like Boris has entered the race, and, well, I thought we probably should. I didn't know if we actually would, but I thought we probably should talk about the runners and riders in the Leadershit election. As soon as Boris appears to be there, then I don't think it's a subject we can really avoid. But before we do, John, you and I were the only ones who were free on the day Liz Truss resigned. So, Matt, I've not really heard your thoughts on the resignation. So I don't know. Is there anything you'd like to add about it before we get stuck into what might happen next? I mean, that day when she resigned, it felt like everything had come to a head, and it didn't feel to me like she could go on any longer after all that trouble around the fracking vote. I think, if nothing else, all that hassle around the fracking vote just seemed to be the sort of the tipping over the edge of her premiership, and that was it. Is that how you felt?
Yeah, I mean, it was the day before, wasn't it? So, but yeah, I mean, this is the strange thing. We don't know what happens behind closed doors. So the 1922 committee is behind closed doors, and they're the only ones that are actually getting the real opinions of MPs, because in public the MPs are mostly going to say, oh yeah, she can still deliver, she can still do this, she's just give her time, she's apologized, but she said she can deliver. And a few will say, well, this is terrible, she has to go. But that behind closed doors the dissenting voices are slowly increasing. So the only indication we get are when things go dramatically wrong, like the votes, like Braverman's resignation, etc. So yeah. I mean, we were told that she wasn't going to last more than another 24 hours by reputable sources, and that's about as good as we get.
Right, runners and riders. There are three essentially, from what we can tell, given who's ruled themselves out and who's just never going to be ruled in. I'm not sure Penny Mordaunt really counts anymore, because Boris Johnson's come in. I think essentially if they have to reach 100, and there's literally only three could possibly achieve 100 backers from the 357 Tory MPs, I think, then clearly, if Sunak is going to take maybe, the best part of 2/3 of that, 3/5 of that, if Boris comes in, I think he knocks Mordaunt out. So I'm not even sure it's worth having a conversation about her, unless either of you would like to say anything about Mordaunt, and then we can get into the sort of...
The conversation is, where would her votes go once she drops out, or actually whether that would be an...
I'm not sure that's how it works, is it?
Well, there won't be a second. Will there be a second vote?
No, I don't think so.
No, it's going to be done in a week.
It's just so Mordaunt doesn't get over 100, so then they'll get potentially 2. And the theory was, let's not go to the members this time, and to do that, we'll have this incredibly high voting number.
Yeah.
And the theory is either one person would achieve it and nobody else would, or if 2 people achieve it, the person with much less than the other person would withdraw, would say, right, well, you've got 250 votes, I've got 100 votes, so clearly...
And there's one further step to that, which is that once they've got the backers, and the backers, of course, is not votes, if one of them doesn't step aside, then what happens is the MPs actually have a vote, which is supposed to be designed to say to the party members, this is what the MPs want, and basically this vote that you've got is essentially supposed to just ratify the decision that the MPs have already made. But of course, there can always be a fly in the ointment when that's the process, and I think Boris coming in is, potentially the fly in the ointment. We'll talk about him in a minute, but yeah, go on to carry on what you were saying, Matt. So
And
I
so
think,
yeah, so at the moment it's only indicative, yeah. And usually we don't know about the indicative sides of things. Usually we get the indicative stuff kind of through rumors and gossip, but actually it's more formal this time. So yeah, the idea is again to give the MPs enough time, or the candidates enough time, to actually resolve it so that there's only one candidate, so it doesn't have to go to the members. That's the main object of the adjustments to the rules that Graham Brady's set up in order to get this done within a week. I think that was his instructions. That was what he had to do. He can't just knock the members out completely. It has to have potentially the option of going to the members at some point. But obviously, if there's only one candidate, it doesn't, because there's no point in going to the members when there's only one person to select from. And that's the hope. That was the hope behind this, the 100 and the indicative thing, and But obviously, Boris potentially has thrown a spanner in the works, because there's a suggestion that Boris wouldn't be amenable to to dropping out, regardless of the number of votes. The assumption is once he gets over 100, then he won't drop out.
Yeah, because this is all about going back to what John and I were saying sort of after we finished recording, but it's on the recording last time. This is all about Johnson's ego, probably, and it's also about the feeling that, and this goes back to the idea that Liz Truss didn't have a mandate because she was put in place by just Tory party members and not by the general public. And of course, there is still this thing that keeps getting brought up, that Boris Johnson is the only one with a mandate from the general public. So even if it wasn't about his ego, it could potentially also be about the fact that he has the mandate and nobody else does. Let's talk about Boris versus Sunak in a minute, or let's come to it via this. Chris Mason from the BBC has just tweeted sort of shortly before we started recording, saying he believes that Boris Johnson, or he's been told that Boris Johnson is up to 100. Now, we've just had a very long conversation before we came on air, so let's try not to talk about the things that we said in the conversation without repeating the things that we said in the conversation, so that we're leaving the listeners stranded. But my sort of belief around this is not that it matters whether Boris Johnson has got 100 backers now, but for Chris Mason to be repeating this suggestion, I think Boris must be close enough, maybe 2/3 or 3/4, that something like this is what's going to make sure he does get to the 100 before the next 48 hours is out, because he's still got, basically, from when we're speaking, about 2 days to make up whatever shortfall he's currently got.
Sorry, can I go, John?
Yeah, go for it.
At the moment, I don't think it's about timing. So remember the last US election. In the first few hours, the Republicans were way ahead, and I went to bed really panicked because I thought, oh my God, Trump's done it again. And actually, we were being told, yeah, but wait, because the Democrats, they vote late, they vote postal, it'll come in. I actually think Johnson's likely to get over 100, but this is a potential possibility why he might not, is because the MPs that would vote for Johnson would have come out about it really quickly in order to signal to Johnson that he had supporters, and because they're lunatics, they're fanatics, essentially.
Well, yeah, I get your point.
So I think most of his support would have come by now, and I think it's going to slow down quite considerably.
But the counter to that is, you've currently, according to the BBC website, and the BBC are only counting people who've actually said, rather than suggestions that they've heard from elsewhere. But according to the BBC website, you've currently got, I think, about 170, no, less than that, about 150 votes counted on the BBC website. which means there's still 200 to count. Now, those people might have already made their decisions. But what I'm saying is, if there's still 200 to count, Boris only has to get 25% of that number in order to take him over the 100. So I'm with Matt. I think he'll get over the 100. And I think it's because the threshold, Graham Brady clearly thought the threshold was high. Turns out the threshold isn't nearly high enough, because I think Boris, even sort of decimated within the party, is not going to struggle too hard to get to that threshold.
Well, sorry, John, you go.
So I think that threshold there, I think I said this on Thursday, is more to keep out the likes of Bradman and Badenoch and to keep this as short as possible.
It's true, but just on that point, I think also the thinking was probably to keep Boris out too, because they must have known there was a possibility.
Well, it was always going to be difficult to keep Boris because he does retain a significant support in the Conservative Party, even if it's not more than 50% of it. But the thing is, they still have to forget everything that's hanging over Boris to do that. And you have to make all these MPs forget that that's possible. Also, that if he gets suspended, as is quite possible, he could be subject to a recall petition. And frankly, if I was, Labour, Lib Dems, I would be going heavily in to persuade, voters to put that recall in as an MP. Could he do the job?
The trouble is, John, you're talking with logic and reason about people who put Truss in 45 days ago and who prior to that had already put Boris Johnson in, knowing exactly what he was like. Yeah, and I think that's the...
But the MPs didn't put Truss in, the members did.
Yeah.
Well, yes, but the MPs had a choice of 9 people to put before the members, and Truss was one of those 2 people.
But then you go back to 2001 when they had choice of Ken Clarke and Ian Duncan Smith were put from the MPs to the members, and Ken Clarke was quite significantly ahead, and the members went for IDS.
Well, yeah, and this time it looks like Sunak's going to be ahead, but if Boris is there, the members could very easily go for Boris again, because if he gets to 100, it goes to the members if he doesn't step aside.
I think in Brady's defence, and in defence of the kind of the old guard of the Conservative Party, I think there comes a point where these things aren't predictable. There comes a point where, well, I think the people voting for Boris are voting illogically. I mean, there are some like Nadine Dorries who obviously she'd be calling for Boris Johnson because she said that way before. But Priti Patel, there are some MPs who it would be before now illogical to vote for Boris Johnson, and they've seen that other MPs have sort of crossed that line. So the fanatics go first, and that emboldens some MPs, and it also, it's all to do with who the main competitor is. So Rishi Sunak was probably going to be a strong candidate, but nobody knew that for certain, and he's not liked by a certain proportion. So if Penny Mordaunt had been at the levels Rishi Sunak was at the moment, then maybe it would have been different. Maybe Johnson, some of the people going for Johnson would have gone for Penny Mordaunt. So there's a lot of unknowns, and I'm not sure. I think possibly 100 may have been about as high as he could have gone without. I don't know. I don't know what the exact rules are about how flexible
I think
the amount he can change the process.
Wasn't the 100 in there as the last stage of the last leadership election as well, to get where you just got down to your 3 candidates, so you had
so it might be that he's still within the process. He's just cut out the interminable sort of round 1, round 2 stages.
Yeah, basically
that makes sense. So Brady's kind of done as much as he can to try and avoid Johnson getting in. But Johnson's a sticky bugger, so
he will find the holes in the rules.
Yeah, and it turns out that a proportion of Conservative MPs are desperate enough to gamble, and it's the red wall ones who will lose their seats, probably if Rishi Sunak is Prime Minister.
Completely.
So they're thinking about their careers rather than anything else. But that's also my point, that most of them, I think, that's where Boris Johnson supporters come from so far, and I think the rest, I think.
But there are like 100 of them That's the thing, and they're still to come out of the woodwork, a lot of them.
Are there 100?
There must be, because the number of Tory seats went up by, got to be something like 80 or 100. So there's red wall seats. They must count. Maybe they don't count for 100, but they must count for a lot. They could certainly count for enough to get Boris over the line. Look, we could talk about the sort of fractions by which Boris might or might not make it for the next hour or something. That's not going to change whether he does or not. There's basically, we're looking at two scenarios, aren't we? One of them we can sort of talk about in 30 seconds and then get to the other one. In one scenario, Boris doesn't make it to 100. If Boris doesn't make it to 100, and like I say, I think he's pretty much knocked Penny Mordaunt out, not necessarily because he's taking her votes, but because just the emphasis moves away from her.
Penny Mordaunt's not going to get to 100.
No, even if
Can't
Boris wasn't there, it looks doubtful, but with Boris there, she's certainly not going to. So the scenario is, if Boris doesn't get to 100 seats, Sunak is the only one, 100 backers. Sunak is the only one who does, and therefore he becomes Prime Minister on Monday morning.
Yeah.
So, or 2 p.m. Monday afternoon, sorry, I should say.
I think there's an interesting thing here is that where do Mordaunt supporters go? Because she could be, I think part of her running is she could be in a position to be kind of a kingmaker here.
Well, she's only got 21 supporters, so I'm not entirely sure that's true.
But if Boris is struggling to get over the line come Monday morning, does he go to Mordaunt and go, here you go, you can have, Foreign Secretary, Home Secretary, whichever position you want?
I suspect.
That's a possibility. Yeah, for sure.
My suspicion is the people that would vote for Penny Mordaunt would not vote for Boris Johnson. Because if there's, that's my suspicion, because I think Penny Mordaunt is more Rishi Sunak than she is Boris Johnson.
Do you think?
I think so. I don't think she looks like it, but I think she probably is, and I think her supporters probably are as well. But I don't think it's a kingmaker territory, because it's not a question of the largest number wins. There is no kingmaker in this situation. It's all about who gets over 100. Except that I do think so. I think
the kingmaker scenario, just to finish that thought, I think the kingmaker scenario would have kicked in if this had been actual votes like it was last time when they had the 9 candidates that they had to whittle down to 2.
Yeah, or it would be if, I suspect they're hoping that if there are 2 candidates, then the one with fewer votes would drop out on Monday, and that would be. So I think Johnson's got a good chance of getting over 100, but it's not certain, because I've still got a theory that most of his votes have come, and I think there's a vast deluge to go to Sunak. But if he does get over 100, I think there's still a chance he might drop out. If Sunak
but this is okay. Yeah, this is the second scenario. So let's go through this bit by bit. So Boris gets to 100. What do we think the chances are that he drops out? Because let's say if Boris gets to 100 and Sunak gets to somewhere between 150 and 200, say, is Boris a kind of character who would drop out?
No, because he knows it has to go to the membership, and he knows he's got a fair amount of support among the membership.
And he also knows that Sunak went to the membership as by far the favourite last time and lost by not as big a margin as people suspected, but still a fairly considerable margin. And I think, for me, I'm with John. I think Boris thinks if it goes to the membership, he can knock Sunak out.
I think that's probably the case, but things we don't know is we don't know what sort of pressure that can be applied to the candidates to drop out. I think if Sunak gets 200 to Johnson's 100, or Sunak gets 250 to Johnson's 100, then I think it's going to be made very clear to Johnson that he's going to struggle to actually govern once he gets in. And I think that does matter. I think that actually matters. I think
it might matter, but I don't know if it matters to Boris.
Again, that's logic.
Well, yeah, but I think there's also the other side is I think there's an assumption that the Conservatives are going to lose in 2 years, regardless of who wins. I think
there is, but also at that point, before you
Yeah.
go any further, there is an assumption that that will happen. But I also think there's probably a fair enough number of Tories who think that the only person who can stop that from happening is Boris.
Yeah, but I don't think they're seriously thinking that. I think they're thinking about their own jobs and trying to scrape back their
Well, I'm not talking about MPs. I'm talking about just Tory party members, people who vote Tory.
They don't know anything. I mean,
But
they're too busy at the golf club. But I think there's a presumption that they're going to lose in 2 years, and I think somewhere in the back of these candidates' mind is, do I want to be Prime Minister for 2 years in a failing economy, having the SHIT kicked out of me, or do I do the noble looking thing, go for party unity, and then come back when the leader of the Conservatives inevitably have to resign in 2 years' time as the kind of the great leader of the opposition, who then kind of, ferries my party through 5 years in opposition, strengthens it, rebuilds it, and becomes a glorious prime minister again. I think that's possible, because
I don't think that's Boris,
so low in
though.
polls.
The thing is, though, you look at the current polling and how many of those possible candidates would lose their seat.
Yeah.
Because it's annihilation on the current scale, and no one's guaranteed to be there.
Yeah.
You could have John Whittingdale left
Didn't
on
we
his
have
own
one
in
report
corner.
that said the Tories would have something like 6 seats according to current polling?
And that's without tactical voting.
Yeah, well, that clearly wouldn't actually happen.
No.
But you just used the phrase "noble looking" when referring to Boris Johnson.
Yes. So not noble, but noble looking. I think one thing Boris Johnson does is look after his future career, and I think this isn't about him doing the right thing for the country or for the party. If he does the right thing for his career, I think stepping down, it sounds anti-intuitive, but stepping down now and letting Sunak take the flak for 2 years, I think that would be best for his career, and so I think that's a possibility. I don't think so. I'm not saying it's likely, but I'm saying it's actually a possibility.
Maybe, but see, Boris Johnson, I cannot see him volunteering to be leader of the opposition. I think the reason he wanted to do it last time was because by winning the leadership election, he'd be flown straight into Downing Street as Prime Minister. And if he wins this one again now, again, straight into Downing Street as Prime Minister, sidestepping all the stages that normally you'd have to go through to get there. And I think Boris Johnson, I don't know, to me, he's just the kind of person who, if you can sidestep a stage, he doesn't care what happens when you get there. He just wants to be there. Just let me finish this one, because this is a really simple, short one. He's a big fan of Churchill, and I think I can't remember who in between might have been, but if I remember rightly, Churchill's the last prime minister to do 2 separate terms, isn't he? So Boris would go in the history books.
Attlee in between.
Attlee in between. So Boris would go into the history books as the second prime minister since Churchill to do that.
Yeah.
Oh, Wilson. Okay, but you know what I mean. Not many prime ministers get to be prime minister and then come back. Not many prime ministers get to do a return, and certainly not within 2 months. So Boris, I mean, for me, Boris is looking at this as vindication. They got rid of me when they shouldn't have got rid of me, and now they want me back. And to me, all I can see when I look at Boris or think about Boris is his ego saying, they want me back. They will want me back. And I'm vindicated that they shouldn't have got rid of me in the first place. And I think that overrides any other concern for him, for me.
I think it's possible, but I'm also wary of treating this like a sort of psychological soap opera, because Johnson is a good political operative. He knows how to like schmooze people and get things done, and he understands the system. And I think, I think it could have, obviously there's ego involved, but there's still sort of other aspects that means this path might not be quite as clear cut as Johnson's glorious return to the prime ministership. I mean, it would be better for the country if Sunak got in. I think it would be better for the Labour Party if Johnson gets in. I think if Johnson gets in, he'll have trouble working with Hunt, obviously.
Oh, that's another point that we need to raise before we get to the end of this. So we'll come back to that in a second.
And he'll have problems operating in the economic situation. So when Johnson got in last time, it was kind of the glorious end of austerity. There was money in the kitty. Johnson could like throw money at the north of England, and he had a big pot of money, a big mandate, so he could kind of go for it. This isn't going to be a fun time to be prime minister, is what I'm saying. He could be making a lot of money in America and going on holiday for 4 weeks in the Caribbean, writing shit books. That's his choice. Do I want to be prime minister when it's not fun?
As John said, sort of before we sat down to record, he got on that plane to come back from the Caribbean early. So I think the question of whether Boris Johnson wants to be back in the Prime Minister's office or not has been answered. That once that plane ticket was bought, he'd answered that question. He came back. He wants it. But at the risk of carrying on again for far too long, let's very quickly go round in a circle, make a prediction. Who do we think will be Prime Minister this time next week? Will it be Boris Johnson, or will it be Rishi Sunak, or will it be somebody else? John?
God. I think the best for the country, because we need someone who the financial markets would see, right or wrong, is a stable pair of hands, would be Sunak. So your logic would say Sunak. But if Johnson gets to 100, I think it's just Boris coming back.
And all I can do is repeat exactly what John said. I think Sunak's the sensible choice. I think if Boris gets to 100, they won't be able to resist him. Matt, what's your actual prediction?
Sunak, odds on for Sunak still. I think the Boris supporters are drumming up a lot of look at how well he's doing. Look at how well he's doing. I think they're overstating it. So I think Sunak, but it could be Johnson. I don't know, because this is happening behind closed doors.
Yeah.
And is a very convoluted process, and it relies on, as you say, there is a psychological element, there's a soap opera element, but there's a hard political element to it. I would say if it is Johnson, then he's not going to last very long.
No, absolutely. Probably. I think the big problem for me, though, is this is all people who've been involved in this for the last few years, and what they really needed, what the Tories, with any sense, really needed to do was forget the people who've been involved in this for the last few years and try and sort of turn over a new leaf. Clearly, they can't, and that's not going to happen. And part of that not happening is the other thing that I think we have to mention before we can move on, because on the 31st, Jeremy Hunt is supposed to be putting his financial statement before the country, in which all of the various departments are going to be tied into a sort of raft of budget spending that probably isn't going to be open to too much shifting over the next few months, if not over the next couple of years. And so here's the thing. Is the new Prime Minister, whoever it's going to be, is the new Prime Minister going to be coming into office on the understanding that they have to keep Hunt? Do they replace Hunt? Do they somehow try and sidestep the sort of financial sort of restrictions that he's put in place? What happens here? Because it looks, and this has been mentioned, but it looks like whatever cabinet comes in with the Prime Minister, there could be a cabinet of lame ducks, because Jeremy Hunt and his department and everybody else involved in this financial statement might already have made all their decisions for them going forwards for at least the next, say, 12 months. So what happens with regards to this financial statement and the cabinet? I think it's a really interesting predicament for the new Prime Minister to be in. Not a nice one for them, and from the outside, a really strange situation. Thoughts?
I think the only really important thing at the moment is for Hunt to remain in place, because again, that's what Britain was being punished for, when Kwarteng made his announcement. they're being punished for not being a stable government. What a sensible government would be doing would be keeping Hunt in place, letting him do the job. Whether that happens or not, depending on the winner, another matter.
Well, this is it. I think Sunak would keep him and would tweak the sort of arrangements that Hunt's made and sort of tweak them at the edges, but try and stick to them as much as possible, with the idea that over the course of time, you can move more towards what Sunak wants and slightly away from what Hunt set in place. But I don't know. But Matt, your thoughts?
Well, I've got a feeling that haven't they all committed to keeping Hunt? Or
I'm not sure. I've not seen it said out loud.
Someone did.
Oh, did they?
Someone said that they would. But yeah, I think they have to keep Hunt, because not because of the relationship between Hunt, not because of Hunt as a person, but because they'll be the last government was brought, or the last prime minister was brought down by the markets, and so they'll be incredibly sensitive to the markets. They'll be hoping that this will cause things to improve immediately, and they'll get confidence back. If it doesn't, then, well, yeah. So I think Hunt has to stay, and I think Boris Johnson would have to work with Hunt. No, not least because they're running out of people.
Yeah.
So you can't have Nadine Dorries as the Chancellor. I mean, you have to have somebody sane as Chancellor.
And on that note, I think actually Boris and Hunt could be, an even crazier soap opera than we've had for the last few years.
Future Cockney rhyming slang.
Well, and definitely on that note, right, we'll be back. God knows, we'll be back on Monday, I suppose. So we'll be back in 48 hours, because on Monday we're going to know whether it's Sunak or whether it goes to the membership, I suppose.
And Doctor Who will have been on as well. So obviously.
Yes, but we're talking about Doctor Who though, right? But we'll also be talking about politics, I suspect, in a separate podcast at some point on Monday. I can't really see us getting any further than that without doing this again. But until we do this again, I was JR.
I was Matt.
And I was John.
And we will speak again soon.